My partner walked out because I had no kids. I returned with twins and no one imagined who their dad was. The familiar intro played in Auntie May's head as she adjusted her microphone. A warm greeting, a reminder to hit subscribe, an invitation for listeners to share where they were tuning in from. Then she leaned in and began the story of the night that split one woman's life in two. Onyx Lounge pulsed with noise and money. Chandeliers threw soft light over marble floors, crystal glasses chimed, and the air was thick with cologne, roasted meat and the sugar rush of melted birthday cake. Cairo, Xavier's 5-year-old nephew, was the little king of the evening, racing between tables in a superhero cape while adults laughed and toasted the St. Clair name. Zenobia St. Clair, Xavier's mother, presided over the room like a monarch inspecting her subjects, her black suit immaculate, pearls shining at her throat, every expression measured and deliberate. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. In the middle of all that life and noise, Xavier sat at the edge of a long table, twisting her cold fingers in her lap under the tablecloth. Everywhere she looked, there were children, toddlers on hips, babies in strollers, teenagers scrolling on phones. Xavier's cousin Tanisha rocked a rosy-cheeked infant, cooing into his ear. A local councilman tossed his giggling daughter into the air while cameras flashed. Families seemed to multiply in every corner, a living reminder of what she did not have. She tried to smile when Cairo streaked past and smeared chocolate across the sleeve of her simple gray dress. She dabbed at it with a wet wipe, her cheeks burning for reasons that had nothing to do with cake. Xavier's aunt, a large woman wrapped in burgundy and perfume, descended on her with sing-song sympathy. "Baby, why are you sitting here like an orphan? Go look at those babies. It's time for you too. That clock doesn't tick forever, you know." Others had already taken their turns, an innocently cruel joke about still not planning, a story about a cousin who had managed to squeeze out a baby just before 35. Each comment landed like a pebble, tiny by itself, but building into a pile that pressed on her chest. Across the room, Xavier laughed at the bar with his cousin Langston, shoulders loose, drink in hand. From where she sat, he looked perfectly at ease, untouched by the tension that crawled along her skin. In her head, the morning replayed for the 100th time. The sterile doctor's office, the stack of test results, the patient's smile. "Keep trying, Mrs. St. Clair. Everything suggests you should conceive eventually." Eventually had stretched into 5 years of hope and disappointment, and Zenobia's patience had thinned to threads. Her glances at Xavier had grown sharper, her compliments shorter. The birthday cake rolled out, a towering pirate ship, sparklers hissing. Children surged forward. Cairo blew out the candles to a burst of applause. For a heartbeat the room was quiet, expectant, happy. In that pocket of silence, Zenobia took a single step forward and raised her glass. "Look at this blessing," she announced, her clear, ringing voice cutting straight to the back wall. "My daughter, my grandson, our friends, everyone here is carrying on our line, building our legacy." She turned her head slowly, her gaze landing squarely on Xavier. "Everyone except one. The only person among us who has given this family nothing. Useless." The word hit like a slap. The music dropped off entirely. Conversation died as if someone had flipped a switch. Dozens of faces turned almost in unison toward the end of the table where Xavier sat frozen. Her ears rang. Her entire world narrowed to Xavier's face. She begged him silently with her eyes. "Say something. Stand up. Tell her she's gone too far. Tell them I am not a mistake." He stared down at his plate instead, methodically dragging his fork through the remains of his salad, rearranging lettuce leaves as if they were the only thing that existed. His silence roared louder than his mother's insult. It wasn't just that he didn't defend her. It was that he agreed. The noise slowly returned like a tide, first whispers, then forced laughter, then the DJ scrambling to restart the playlist. The party rolled forward as if nothing had happened, crushing her under its wheels. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, clinking glasses, polite smiles, the taste of ash in her mouth. She barely remembered the drive home, only the rain starting to hammer the windshield and Xavier's jaw locked so tightly that a muscle jumped in his cheek. Inside their apartment, warm lamplight didn't soften his face. He didn't take off his coat or loosen his tie. He simply stood in the hallway and looked at her as if she were a stranger who had shown up by mistake. "Mother's right," he said, his voice flat and tired. "I need a real family." The floor seemed to tilt. "Xavier, what are you talking about? Pack your things." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just issued the words like an order. "You have half an hour. 30 minutes. 30 minutes to erase 5 years of marriage." She stumbled into the bedroom, hands shaking as she pulled clothes from hangers and drawers, stuffing them blindly into a small duffel bag. Shirts, jeans, a sweater, a toothbrush. She couldn't remember what she owned, what mattered. Tears blurred her vision, but her hands kept moving by habit. In the doorway, Xavier watched with that same blank detachment, like a guard waiting for a prisoner to vacate her cell. He didn't offer her cab fare, didn't ask where she would go, didn't flinch when she brushed past him with her bag. He opened the door for her without a word and closed it behind her with a click that sounded like a verdict. The night outside greeted her with cold sheets of rain. Water soaked her coat in seconds and plastered her hair to her forehead as she walked, not knowing where, just away. Streetlights smeared and doubled behind the veil of tears and rain. His words pounded in her skull with every step. "Useless. I need a real family. Useless." She stopped at last under the awning of a corner store, shaking so hard she could barely grip the zipper of her purse. She fumbled inside for a tissue, fingers numbed by cold and shock. Keys, wallet, lipstick, then something small and rigid, a cardboard box she had forgotten. Her breath hitched. That morning, after leaving the doctor's office, she ducked into a pharmacy on a trembling impulse, bought a test, and took it in a small restroom with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. 2 clear lines had appeared almost instantly, bright as sunrise. For an hour she had floated, carrying a secret so big it felt like it might burst out of her chest. Tonight, at the party, she had planned to whisper the news to Xavier as a gift, a private victory, proof that all the years of trying hadn't been for nothing. With the rain drumming around her, she opened the box and stared at the white plastic stick inside. The lines were still there. 2 solid stripes, not washed away by the storm, not erased by Zenobia's words or Xavier's ultimatum. Inside her, life was quietly growing. His life. The child of the man who had just thrown her into the street for failing to give him exactly that. A strange cracked sound tried to rise from her throat, part sob, part laugh, but nothing came out. For a moment the world stopped falling apart. It simply hung there, suspended, as a new stubborn thought formed inside the shattered pieces of her heart. She was not alone. Whatever happened next, one truth was already written in her blood. She was a mother. She thought of her parents across town and of the judgment that would follow Zenobia's version of the story. She imagined her mother's tears, her father's stiff, humiliated silence. She couldn't show up at their door drenched in scandal and shame, not tonight. Her hand moved almost by itself, pulling out her phone and scrolling to a number she hadn't used in years. Iona. Her voice sounded raw and unfamiliar when her friend answered, sleepy and confused. Kaz. What's wrong? Are you crying? Can I stay with you for a couple of days? The words scraped their way out. Please. There was a short silence on the line, then Iona's answer came, steady and solid as a lifeline. Not for a couple of days. For as long as you need. Just come. By dawn, a train was carrying Kezia away from the city that had turned on her, toward Savannah and the friend who still saw her as more than a broken promise. 2 words spun on a loop in her head as the tracks clattered beneath her, useless and pregnant. Somewhere between the rhythm of the wheels and the swelling ache in her chest, a thin layer of steel began to harden around her pain. They had crossed her name out of their lives. Maybe that was a gift. From now on, she decided, she would raise this child, or whatever surprise waited inside her, without their poison. And they would never know. Savannah greeted her with warm air and the smell of coffee from Iona's tiny kitchen. For the first time in days, Kezia slept without jerking awake in tears. She helped with chores, moved slowly through the motions of living, and spoke only when Iona gently nudged her toward words. When she finally told the story of the party and the rain and the slammed door, she left out one detail: the small plastic test now hidden at the bottom of her bag. That secret felt like a small candle she wasn't ready to show anyone. But secrets need care, and so do futures. One morning, she woke with a clear thought: she needed a doctor. She booked an appointment under her maiden name, Price, and sat in a clinic waiting room surrounded by women with rounded bellies and partners filling out forms. She felt like an imposter holding someone else's ticket. When her name was called, she climbed onto the ultrasound table with a heart beating too fast for the quiet room. Cold gel, the gentle pressure of the probe, the doctor's eyes on the monitor. "All right, Ms. Price, let's take a look. That's a normal intrauterine pregnancy, about 12 weeks along, heartbeat nice and strong." The doctor's tone was brisk and reassuring. Relief washed over Xavier so suddenly that she almost laughed. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the rain-soaked sidewalk. Then the doctor frowned, not with worry, but with curiosity. "Well now, look at that." She tilted the monitor a little. "You didn't mention anyone told you there might be more than one." A knot of fear tightened in Xavier's chest. "More than one what?" "Baby," the doctor said, smiling now. "Here's one heartbeat. And here's another. Congratulations, Mama. You're carrying twins." The words seemed to echo off the walls. Twins. Two. Not a single child, but a double blessing, or a double challenge, depending on where you were standing. Alone, jobless, and in a borrowed apartment, she suddenly felt the air thin. Tears burned her eyes again, but they were different this time, a wild mix of terror, awe, and something stubbornly like joy. She left the clinic with a blurry printout of two tiny shapes and a heart that had no clue how it was going to manage, only that it had to. Back at Iona's apartment, she unpacked her bag for real, trying to make space for the new life that would soon demand cribs and clothes and bottles. Among the folded shirts and a pair of books, her fingers brushed a small, worn hardback notebook. She frowned, then recognized it. Pearl St. Clair's diary, Xavier's grandmother's journal that had ended up with her by accident when boxes of old family papers were sorted. She had always meant to give it to Zenobia and had forgotten. In her haste the night she was thrown out, she must have swept it into the bag along with everything else. She thought about tossing it. It felt like a fragment from a world she needed to leave behind. But curiosity won. Settling on the couch, she opened it to the first page. The neat, cramped handwriting described small things: rain in the garden, a new rosebush, the grandchildren's mischief. Then one entry stopped her cold. May 15th. Another hard talk with Zenobia today. Again this talk of an heir. Poor Thomas is tired of tests, tired of numbers. Doctors say chances are low but not impossible. But Zenobia, she looks at him like he is broken. She talks about our duty to carry on the name. Today she spoke about finding other ways if God does not grant us a child naturally. It frightened me. There is something burning in her that is not love. I fear what she might do. Xavier read the lines twice, then a third time. Thomas, Xavier's father. For all those years, Zenobia had been haunted by the idea that the St. Clair men might not be able to produce heirs. Her fixation had begun long before Xavier married into the family, long before anyone whispered useless in her direction. The cruelty had roots deeper than personal dislike. It was an old sickness wrapped in family pride. A chill crawled up her spine. She snapped the diary closed and shoved it back into the bag. She had no energy to untangle the twisted history of people who had thrown her away. Her own history was rewriting itself far from them, and she had urgent questions to answer. Where would she live? How would she raise two children with no help? How could she become someone her babies could lean on? The answer, strangely enough, rose from a kitchen cupboard. That evening, desperate to occupy her hands and calm her mind, she baked a simple peach cobbler from her mother's recipe. The scent of cinnamon and warm fruit filled the little apartment, wrapping itself around her like a familiar embrace. Iona came home from work, took one bite and stared at her as if she'd performed a magic trick. "You did this." "I didn't burn it, so I guess that's something," Xavier joked weakly. "Are you kidding? This is ridiculous." Iona took another forkful, rolled her eyes in bliss, and by the next morning had carried half of it to her office, where it vanished in minutes. Soon co-workers were asking if her friend took orders. One needed birthday cupcakes. Another wanted a cake for an anniversary. A third asked if she could manage a dessert table for a small party. So she baked. She experimented. She failed, cursed quietly, tried again. Her swollen ankles ached, her back throbbed, but each tray of golden pastries cooling on the counter felt like proof that she still had value, that her hands could create something people actually wanted. Money trickled in, modest at first, but entirely hers. For the first time in years, she wasn't someone's add-on. She was the center of her own small universe. The twins arrived after a difficult labor, but in perfect health. Kenzo and Clair, light-skinned, with matching dimples that appeared whenever they yawned or fussed. Holding one in each arm, skin still damp and eyes stubbornly closed, she understood in an instant that whatever had come before could never touch this new reality unless she allowed it. These children were not bargaining chips or legacy tokens. They were her miracle and her responsibility. Time bent into a new rhythm. Mornings meant dropping the twins at daycare once they were old enough, then hurrying to a tiny rented space she slowly turned into a bakery. Afternoons were a blur of sugar, flour, invoices and suppliers. Evenings belonged to bedtime stories and sticky kisses in a small apartment above the shop, where lullabies drifted up through the smell of cooling cake. The sign over the door read, "Xavier's Sweets," and regulars began to speak of Ms. Price with affection, as though she had always belonged to this street. 3 years slipped by. The twins grew into loud, delightful chaos. The shop's glass case was never empty for long. Locals brought friends, posted photos, left glowing reviews. When she wiped down the counter at closing time, listening to the soft breathing of her children upstairs on the baby monitor, she sometimes remembered the rain and the alley and the label, "useless." The memory no longer burned, it merely reminded her of how far she had walked. She kept her past at arm's length. Calls to her parents were brief and careful, routed through Iona's landline. She spoke of work, of being busy, of "some kids I help look after," but never said the words son or daughter. Fear still perched in the back of her mind. Fear that news would travel fast, that the St. Clair name would sniff her out and try to claim or deny what was hers. She changed her number, made no effort to track Xavier's life, and pretended that old diary didn't exist. It took one phone call to fracture the peace she had built. Her father's voice trembled down the line, older and thinner than she remembered. "Kaz, your mother. Her heart. They've taken her to the hospital." In an instant, the careful line she'd drawn between past and present dissolved. Airline searches, hurried arrangements at the bakery, hurried explanations to her assistant, suitcases pulled from under beds. That afternoon she buckled Kenzo and Clair into train seats, their wide eyes reflecting her own fear. Outside, Savannah's familiar streets slid away. Ahead lay the city she'd sworn never to set foot in again, and the people who had once decided she wasn't worth keeping. But this time, she told herself as the train rattled north and her children's heads drooped against her shoulders, she wasn't coming back empty-handed. She was returning as a mother, a business owner, and a woman who had rebuilt herself once already. Whatever waited for her there, she would not face it as the same trembling figure who had stood in the rain with a plastic box in her hand. The city of her childhood looked smaller when she stepped onto the platform with a child holding each hand. The same cracked sidewalks, the same faded awnings, but she felt taller somehow, even with anxiety gripping her stomach. Her father stopped dead when he saw the twins. Surprise and confusion flickered across his face, followed by a tentative softness she hadn't seen in years. "Are they your grandchildren?" she said gently. "Kenzo and Clair." At the hospital, her mother lay pale and fragile beneath thin blankets, but her eyes filled with light when the twins toddled to the side of the bed. Her hand trembled as she stroked their hair. In that moment, Whatever shame and fear had kept Kezia away seemed foolish. This was family too, a gentler kind of legacy than anything Zenobia had ever preached about. The city itself, however, had a different memory. Small towns carry gossip like electricity. A trip to the corner store for milk was enough to set the rumor mill spinning. Miss Jenkins from the old building caught sight of her in the produce aisle and nearly dropped a bag of rice. "Lord, child, you're back? And who are these precious angels?" she asked, eyes darting greedily between mother and children. "Just kids," Kezia answered with a strained smile, tugging them closer. She didn't give names, didn't explain. It didn't matter. By evening, whispers had already reached every hallway, salon, and bar. The discarded wife was back, with 2 children who looked an awful lot like a certain family. She tried to keep her world small. Hospital, her parents' apartment, the playground across the street. But errands couldn't be avoided forever. One afternoon she went to the Central Market to buy the pomegranates the doctor had recommended for her mother's recovering heart. The air smelled of dill, earth and ripe fruit. She was bending over a crate, choosing the heaviest, when Kenzo tugged her sleeve. "Mama, that man is looking." She turned, pomegranates cradled in her arm, and froze. A few yards away, Xavier stood in a tailored coat, staring at her as if a ghost had materialized between the stalls. He looked almost exactly as he had 3 years before, only thinner around the eyes, the skin more tired. His gaze slid from her face down to the twins pressed against her legs, then back again. Beside him stood a woman the city hadn't yet had time to describe in its stories, a striking beauty in a sand-colored cashmere coat, hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless. The coat was cut loose, but even with its drape, the roundness beneath it was obvious. A pregnant belly, ripe and proud, rested between her expensive lapels. Time stretched into something brittle. Xavier took a hesitant step forward. "Kezia," he said, her name rough in his mouth. "Xavier," she answered, her voice surprisingly even. She pulled the twins closer, her fingertips digging into their coats. The woman at his side glanced between them, confusion knitting her smooth brow. Xavier swallowed, cleared his throat. "This is Soraya, my wife." The word fell like a small stone into deep water. Wife. So he had replaced her with a polished, picture-perfect successor and, apparently, corrected his mistake by doing what he once said she could not, becoming a father. The ache in her chest was sharp but oddly clean. The old wound reopened, but around it was scar tissue built from years of sleepless nights and bakery mornings. "Hello," she said curtly, giving Soraya a single nod. Xavier opened his mouth as if to ask something. About the children, about her life, but fear and shame warred on his face. Instead of questions, he offered cowardice. "We have to go," he muttered, lightly steering Soraya away. They vanished into the market crowd, the back of that cashmere coat the last thing she saw. Only when they turned the corner did she realize her hand still crushed the pomegranate bag, juice seeping through the thin paper. By evening, the chance encounter had spun through the city, tangled with older gossip. The discarded wife, the new wife, the twins. Speculation bloomed like mold. It didn't take long for the story to reach the person most invested in policing the St. Clair image. A few days later, while the twins chased pigeons in the small square near her parents' building, a shadow fell across the bench where Kezia sat. The scent of expensive perfume arrived a second before the voice. "I knew you'd crawl back eventually." Zenobia stood in front of her in a black coat sharp enough to cut. Age had not softened her. If anything, the lines at the corners of her mouth had deepened into permanent contempt. Her eyes slid over the playing children and narrowed. "So that's your little plan? Drag some stray brats here and hope my son pities you," she sneered. "You really think you can pass off someone else's bastards as St. Clair blood?" 3 years ago those words would have shattered something inside Kezia. Now anger rose, but behind it stood exhaustion and a hard, cold clarity. She stood, leveling herself until they were eye to eye. "These are my children," she said calmly. "And they are none of your business. Stay away from them. And from me." A vein pulsed in Zenobia's temple. Do you think you can threaten me, girl? You, who my son threw out like trash. You come back here to ruin our name when our real heir is on the way? I won't let you taint us with your lies. Her voice rose, drawing curious glances from passers-by. I came to see my sick mother, Xavier replied, her words clipped and steady. You can shove your fantasies back into whatever dark place you found them. If you come near us again, I'll involve the police. She took Kenzo's and Kalia's hands and walked away without looking back. Her heart hammered, but not from fear, from rage and a new resolve crystallizing around it. Zenobia wasn't going to stop with insults. She would whisper to neighbors, poison reputations, paint Xavier as a schemer out to scam the family. And the easiest target in any such story would be the twins. That night, after the children were asleep and the sounds of the hospital corridors faded to a distant hum in her ears, Xavier sat at the kitchen table with her father and a laptop. She typed "family lawyer" into a search bar and found a woman whose reviews mentioned words like relentless and fair. Ms. Davis listened to the entire story over coffee in a small office lined with law books. She didn't interrupt, didn't wince at the ugliest parts. When Xavier finished, the lawyer steepled her fingers and said, "They will say you're making this up. They'll claim the children aren't his and paint you as a gold digger. The best way to cut that off is to move first." How? File to establish paternity and child support, Ms. Davis replied. Officially. We'll request DNA testing. If those kids are his, the results will say so. Once that's on paper, no one will be able to call them imposters without looking like a fool. The idea made her stomach knot. DNA tests meant letting Xavier back into the story she'd fought to end. But this wasn't about him. It was about Kenzo and Kalia's right to their own truth and the shield that truth could provide. Do it, she said. I'm not asking for their money. I'm asking for the facts. Within days, a neat envelope bearing the court seal landed on Xavier St. Clair's desk, summoning him to submit to paternity testing. It was the first time she had forced herself into his world since the night he closed the door on her, and this time she wasn't coming as a supplicant. She had fired a legal flare straight into the heart of the St. Clair image machine. She expected an explosion, shouting, threats, lawyers with cold eyes. Instead, the response arrived in an evening knock on her parents' apartment door. When she peered through the peephole, she saw not Xavier, not Zenobia, but the woman from the market, Soraya, in a dress too fine for the worn stairwell, fear etched into the flawless lines of her face. Her mascara had smudged, and her hands shook as she clutched a leather briefcase. "Please," she said when Xavier opened the door. "Can we talk inside?" In the small kitchen, Soraya set the briefcase on the table, flipped the latches, and revealed stacks of cash. Enough to buy an apartment outright, enough to move across the country, enough to disappear. "I'm begging you," she whispered, eyes bright with panic. "Withdraw the lawsuit. Take this, go anywhere but drop it. That test. It will ruin everything." "For whom?" Xavier asked quietly. "You should be thrilled if it proves these kids aren't his. Your child would be the only heir then, wouldn't they?" Color drained from Soraya's cheeks. Her fingers tightened on the briefcase handle. "You don't understand what she'll do," she said. "What she's capable of. You're poking a nest you can't see into." "Then help me see," Xavier shot back. But Soraya only shook her head, silent, trapped inside some private terror. "I can't tell you," she said at last, voice breaking. "I can only ask. Please. Walk away. Take the money." "I'm not for sale," Xavier replied. She pushed the briefcase back across the table. "And neither are my children." Soraya stared at her for a long moment, the hope draining from her eyes. Then she clicked the case shut, stood up and walked to the door. At the threshold, she hesitated, as if there were 1,000 things she wanted to say and no words for any of them. In the end, she left without looking back. When the door closed, the apartment felt colder. The money had been tempting not for what it could buy, but for what it promised, escape. But the moment she'd imagined taking it, She'd seen Zenobia's satisfied smile in her mind, a smile that said she had won again. No. Better to rip the cover off whatever this family was hiding, and let the world see what crawled underneath. Later that night, alone at the table with the house quiet around her, she pulled Pearl's diary from her bag and opened it to the entry about Zenobia's obsession. The words felt heavier in the light of Soraya's fear. Ready to do anything, the old woman had written. Back then, Xavier had dismissed it as an exaggeration. Now, with legal papers in motion and a briefcase of hush money still echoing in her mind, anything no longer sounded like a figure of speech. Somewhere in this tangle of pride, lies, and secret terror was the truth about why Zenobia was so desperate to avoid a simple test. To find it, Xavier would have to look backward and sideways, not just at her own pain, but at the history of a family that had treated her like a defective tool. And for that, she needed someone who had known the street Clairs long before they turned into a brand. Dr. Thaddeus's office smelled exactly as it had when she was a child, antiseptic and dust and faint peppermint. The old physician moved more slowly now, but his eyes were still sharp behind his glasses. He examined Kenzo and Kalia with gentle hands, declared them healthy, and let them press their noses to the glass of his fish tank while he updated their charts. Only when the twins were absorbed by a particularly fat goldfish did Xavier clear her throat. "Doctor," she began carefully, "I found something that mentions you. An old diary. Pearl St. Clair wrote about her daughter-in-law coming to see you. About Zenobia." His hand paused over the paper. "Pearl always watched that girl with worry," he murmured. "What did she write?" "She said Zenobia was obsessed with having an heir," Xavier replied. "Thomas's test results weren't great, but not hopeless. Yet Zenobia started talking about other ways to get a child with the St. Clair name. Pearl said it frightened her." A shadow crossed the doctor's face. He removed his glasses, wiped them slowly, and set them on the desk. For a moment he seemed to weigh something invisible in his mind. "It was many years ago," he said finally. "Before Xavier married you." He stood and walked to the window, staring out as he spoke. "She came to me alone, brought a folder full of lab results. Some were Xavier's, some Thomas's. She wanted me to declare that her son would never have children. When I told her nothing was certain, she became agitated. Then she asked about donor banks, clinics, clinicians who worked quietly. She wanted to know if there were discreet ways to solve her problem without it ever touching the family name." He shook his head, his shoulders sagging. "I told her to leave. I said she was letting fear drive her mad. I thought she had heard me. I told myself she'd calm down, that it was all talk." He turned then, his eyes old with regret. "Now you tell me about that diary, about this test you filed for, about your children. And I wonder what she did with the ideas I refused to give her." His words chilled her. The pieces were on the table now. An obsession with heirs that stretched back decades, a belief that her son might be infertile, and a willingness to find alternative solutions behind everyone's backs. Add to that Soraya's terror of a DNA test and Zenobia's fury at the twins' mere existence, and the picture that formed was ugly. On the walk back, the twins skipping ahead of her, the past replayed in shards. She thought of Langston always hovering close at family gatherings, his compliments just a little too smooth. She remembered the lakehouse reception, thrown by Zenobia months before the night she was cast out, the swirling guests, the heavy toasts to future St. Clair heirs. She remembered how hard Xavier had drunk that evening, knocking back glass after glass whenever someone mentioned children. By midnight he'd been half-slumped in an armchair, eyes unfocused, speech slurred. Zenobia had stood over him, tight-mouthed, disgust curling her lip as if his weakness were an embarrassment, not a cry for help. Xavier had developed a pounding headache, the noise turning into a dull roar in her skull. She'd wanted to go home but didn't have the car keys. "Let me get you some water," Langston had said, appearing at her side with a too bright smile. "Aunt Zenobia has this herbal stuff that always helps me." The glass he handed her tasted faintly bitter. Within minutes, the floor felt as though it floated an inch beneath her feet. Her limbs grew heavy, the room blurred. She had managed to excuse herself and ask him to drive her home. He had guided her to the car, hand low on her back, voice syrupy with concern. At the apartment door she had clung to the frame, forced a smile, and shut him out quickly, locking the deadbolt with fingers that barely obeyed. Back then, she had written it off as a miserable night, a drunk husband, a manipulative mother-in-law, an over-helpful cousin. Now, with Pearl's diary and Dr. Thaddeus's confession in her ears, that evening looked different. What if she hadn't locked the door so fast? What if she'd been a little sicker, a little weaker? What exactly had Zenobia planned in that big house by the lake, with one St. Clair man incapacitated and another being ushered toward her dizzy, disoriented daughter-in-law? She needed proof, not just suspicion. That night, after the twins fell asleep under her mother's mumbled prayers, she turned on her old laptop and dug through folders from years ago. It took time, but she finally found it, a set of photos from the lake house party, taken by guests. Faces laughing, glasses raised, children splashing near the dock. Then she saw the one that froze her blood. A snapshot of her and Langston near the veranda doors. She looked pale and unfocused, one hand pressed to her temple. Langston stood close, a glass of water visible in his hand, mouth open on some comment. At first glance, it was nothing more than an awkward party picture. In the background, however, hung a large ornamental mirror. Zooming in grain by grain, she saw the reflection of the house's interior hallway and, in its shadows, the clear outline of Zenobia. She stood half in the dark, watching the two figures at the door. Her face in the reflection held no concern, no surprise, only cold calculation, the patient focus of someone monitoring an experiment. There it was. Not a confession, not a signed plan, but a captured moment showing exactly where she stood and what she watched. Combined with the diary and the doctor's account, it drew a line through the years straight to this present mess. Zenobia had wanted to turn her into an unsuspecting surrogate, using Langston's body and her womb to produce the perfect heir while preserving the St. Clair name on paper. When the attempt failed, or seemed to, she'd simply discarded the vessel. But life had written its own script. Sometime before that party, long before bitter water and staged concern, a tiny cluster of cells had already settled into her womb, Xavier's child, not Langston's. Two of them, as it turned out. Zenobia's rage at the sight of the twins now made horrifying sense. To her, they were proof that, for once, her manipulation hadn't been the hand on the wheel. Knowing this was one thing. Proving it in a way that would stop her was another. Going to the police with half-remembered details and an old mirror photo would get her nothing but raised eyebrows. Accusing Xavier would only pull him further under his mother's control. She needed another kind of reckoning, one that attacked the only thing Zenobia truly cherished, her reputation. An idea took shape, sharp and theatrical. Her bakery in Savannah often hosted small charity events. This city had an orphanage that always needed support. The street Clairs loved nothing more than being photographed donating to noble causes. What if she organized a charity auction, sent invitations to everyone in town, and made sure the St. Clair table sat front and center? What if the truth was laid out not in a quiet office, but under chandeliers, in front of cameras, with half the city watching? Planning the event kept her moving. She met with the orphanage director, booked a modest banquet hall, convinced local artists and businesses to donate items for bidding. Old classmates volunteered to help decorate. Her father made calls. People were curious. Some wanted to support the cause. Others simply wanted a front-row seat to whatever drama might unfold between the disgraced ex-wife and the family she'd once married into. On the eve of the auction, she returned home exhausted, nerves stretched thin. Her mother slept. The twins snored softly in their shared bed. Xavier sat in the kitchen with cold tea, going over her opening speech in her head, when a knock sounded at the door again, so soft it seemed almost apologetic. This time, when she checked the peephole, it was again Soraya. But the polished woman from before was gone. Her hair was messy, mascara streaked down her cheeks, and she wore no coat despite the chill. "What now?" Xavier asked, bone-tired, when she opened the door. "Have you brought a bigger suitcase this time?" Soraya stepped in and, before Xavier could say anything else, collapsed into a chair and broke into loud, shaking sobs. Not the controlled tears of a woman trying to negotiate, but the ugly, exhausted crying of someone who had finally hit the end of their rope. "She knows," Soraya gasped when she could breathe again. "She knows about the lawsuit, the auction, everything. She said if I'm not sitting at her table tomorrow with a smile, she'll destroy my father. He'll lose everything. I can't." "You chose this marriage," Xavier said wearily. "You knew who she was." "No," Soraya snapped, wiping her face. "I knew nothing. My father's business was drowning. She appeared like a savior, paid off his debts, saved our house. But there was a price. I had to become the perfect Mrs. St. Clair. Xavier doesn't love me. He loves doing what she tells him. I'm just part of the decor." The bitterness in her voice surprised Xavier. She had pictured this woman as smug and secure, not as a trapped pawn. "And then you came back with the children," Soraya went on. "She lost control. She said you would ruin everything, make people ask questions about her son, about whether he could produce an heir at all. And then she ordered me to fix it." "Fix it how?" Soraya's eyes flicked to the hallway, as if Zenobia might be listening from behind the door. Then she did something that made the air in the room go still. She stood, reached under the side seam of her dress, and tugged. Hidden straps loosened. With shaking hands, she pulled something out from under the fabric and set it on the table between them. A perfectly crafted silicone pregnancy belly, round and smooth, the exact size of 7 or 8 months along. Underneath, her own stomach was flat. "I'm not pregnant," she whispered. "I've never been pregnant in my life. She made me buy this. Made me see her doctor who signed off on the lie. The plan was to parade me around town, let everyone fawn over the heir on the way, and then, later, invent a tragedy. A miscarriage. A stillbirth. Something too painful to talk about. Just enough time for her to bury your children in rumors and cement the story that Xavier can have a child with the right woman." The silicone belly lay on the table like a grotesque prop from a bad play. Xavier stared at it, at Soraya's raw, desperate face, and felt something twist inside her. "I can't do it anymore," Soraya said, voice breaking again. "I can't live strapped into this lie, being measured and dressed and posed like a mannequin. Tomorrow she wants me at your event, smiling for cameras, clutching my fake stomach while she plays benevolent matriarch. I don't have the strength." "Then don't go," Xavier said quietly. "You don't understand. If I cross her, she'll crush my father. She'll call in favors, cancel contracts, freeze accounts. He'll lose everything." Soraya pressed her palms to her eyes. "I'm begging you, finish this. Expose her. I will say whatever you need me to say tomorrow. Just make it stop." Something shifted between them at that moment. The woman who had arrived with a suitcase of money and a plea was no longer a rival trying to buy silence. She was another casualty of the same ruthless will that had thrown a young wife into the rain 3 years earlier. "All right," Xavier said slowly. "Then we do it together." She didn't sleep the rest of the night. The silicone belly sat in a shopping bag by the door like a mute witness. On the table lay Pearl's diary, the mirror photo printed out from her laptop, and the folded DNA results she had quietly ordered to confirm what her heart already knew. The pieces of the puzzle were lined up. The only thing left was to step onto the stage she'd built and drop them in front of everyone who had ever believed Zenobia's version of the truth. The banquet hall hummed with the low buzz of expensive perfume and whispered speculation. Fairy lights crisscrossed the ceiling, and the auction items, paintings, jewelry, gift certificates, gleamed under soft spotlights. But most eyes weren't on the donations. They flicked toward the front, where a table with the St. Clair name card sat like a small island in the middle of the room. Zenobia's gown was the color of dark wine, her posture straight as a spear. Xavier sat at her right hand, his tie knotted perfectly, his face a careful mask of polite disinterest. On his other side, in a flowing dress that cleverly disguised the absence of the silicone beneath it, sat Soraya, pale but composed. A few chairs away lounged Langston, spinning his champagne glass with restless fingers, scanning the room for anyone who might be watching him. They were framed perfectly, the picture of wealth and continuity, as local reporters snapped photos under the guise of covering a charity event. That was what Xavier had counted on. She took the stage when the host invited her to say a few words as organizer. Fingers around the microphone, she drew a breath and let her gaze travel over the room. Old classmates, former neighbors, city officials, strangers who had come out of curiosity. At the front table, Zenobia watched her with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good evening," Xavier began. "Thank you all for coming to support the children of Hope House. Tonight's auction will help fund tutors, new beds, and maybe even a small playground. Every bid you make is a hand reaching out to a child who hasn't had enough hands reaching out for them." The words were true, and she meant them. But another truth pressed against the back of her teeth, waiting its turn. She let the brief applause die down. "There's something else I want to talk about," she said, her voice gaining an edge. "Something about the way we treat children before they're even born. About how an obsession with legacy can twist people who say they love us." A ripple moved through the crowd. At the St. Clair table, Zenobia's smile faltered. "3 years ago," Xavier went on, "I sat at a family celebration not far from here, surrounded by kids. My mother-in-law raised her glass and publicly called me useless because I hadn't given her a grandchild. My husband stayed silent. That same night, he told me I no longer qualified as part of his real family, and put me out in the rain with a bag of clothes." Murmurs rose, louder this time. People shifted in their seats, stealing glances at Xavier, whose face drained of color. Zenobia's fingers whitened around her wineglass. "I left that house broken," Xavier said. What none of them knew, and what even I had only just learned, was that I was already pregnant. Not with one child, but with 2. With twins. She let that sink in. The woman they called barren, the wife they threw away, was already carrying the grandchildren they had prayed for. "That's a lie," Langston burst out, pushing to his feet. "She's inventing this to make us look bad." She kept her eyes on him, her tone cool. "Is it? Or is that what you've all been telling yourselves? That those children must be someone else's, because the only story you can accept is the one she wrote for you?" She nodded toward Zenobia. "Sit down," Zenobia hissed under her breath, but the microphones picked it up. "The truth is," Xavier continued, "Zenobia St. Clair has been terrified for decades that her son might be infertile, just as her late husband was nearly so. We know this from Pearl St. Clair's own words." She held up a copy of the diary page. "We know she went to family doctors asking about quiet ways to get an heir without anyone ever knowing." "You have no right to speak about my family," Zenobia snapped, finally breaking her silence. "You sign papers saying you wanted nothing from us, then come back as a vulture." "I wanted nothing from you," Xavier agreed. "Until you came after my children. Until you called them bastards in a public park. Until your son received a court order for a DNA test and your new daughter-in-law showed up at my door with enough cash to buy my silence." Gasps rippled through the hall. All heads turned to Soraya, who sat very still, eyes shining with contained fear. "This is nonsense," Zenobia said through clenched teeth. "She's trying to blackmail us." "Then why," Xavier asked softly, "is your son so afraid of a simple swab and a lab result?" She tapped her phone, and the large screen behind her flicked to the lake house photo. "Why did you watch from the shadows while your nephew plied me with bitter water and your son sat too drunk to stand?" The enlarged image showed her and Langston near the door, his hand holding a glass, her body leaning with exhaustion. In the background, Zenobia's reflection in the mirror stared at them with sharp, murderous focus. The room went silent except for the clicks of camera shutters. "You set up a situation that would have allowed your nephew to step into your son's place without anyone knowing," Xavier said, her voice clear now. "You were willing to turn your daughter-in-law into an unknowing surrogate, so long as the surname stayed clean." "That's enough," Zenobia barked, rising to her feet. "This woman is delusional. She's always been unstable. We did everything for her." Before she could launch into a tirade, Soraya stood up, her chair scraping sharply against the floor. Without a word, she reached for the neckline of her dress, tugged it up enough to free the thin harness beneath, and with one swift movement unfastened it. The silicone belly slid out and dropped to the floor with a soft thud that somehow echoed louder than any shout. Under her dress, her midsection was flat. The room exploded. Some people stood to get a better look. Others covered their mouths. A reporter's flash nearly blinded the front row. "This," Soraya said, picking up the prosthetic and holding it high, "is the kind of lie Zenobia St. Clair will build to protect her image. She made me wear this every day. She made a doctor lie for us. She planned to show off a fake pregnancy and then invent a tragedy later just to prove her son could produce an heir with the right woman." Her voice shook but carried clearly through the speakers. "I agreed at first because I was scared and because she owns my father's debt. But I won't be part of this anymore." Zenobia's mouth opened and closed, searching for a script that would fix this scene. There wasn't one. The mask she'd worn for years cracked down the middle. Around their table, the crowd's mood shifted from shock to disgust. People who had once courted her favor now moved their chairs away. Langston slumped back into his seat, hands over his face, muttering that it had all been her idea, that he had just followed orders. Only Xavier sat utterly still, like someone who'd just woken from a long sleep to find his house on fire. Kezia stepped down from the stage and walked toward him. Cameras followed, but the room felt strangely quiet. She reached into her purse and set 2 items in front of him. A phone screen showing a time-stamped photo of that old pregnancy test and a folded sheet of paper bearing a lab's letterhead. "I took this test the morning of Cairo's birthday party," she said quietly. "Before the lake house, before any so-called alternative plans." She tapped the paper. "And these are DNA results. I did them privately before filing anything in court, because I wanted to be sure. Kenzo and Kalia are your children, Xavier. Your blood. The heirs your mother worshipped, the ones you threw out on the street without asking a single question." He looked from the photo to the document, lips moving soundlessly as he scanned the lines. Then his eyes rose to meet hers, raw and unguarded. There were apologies there, and horror, and the crumbling of a man who had built his life on borrowed convictions. "I didn't know," he whispered. "You didn't want to know," she replied. "That's the difference." There was nothing more to say. Whatever happened to the St. Clair empire now? Lawsuits, divorces, business deals collapsing, was no longer her concern. She turned away from the table, from the cameras, from the murmuring crowd, and walked toward the exit. People parted for her without thinking, as if something in them recognized the invisible weight she was putting down. Outside, the night air felt cool and shockingly clean. She drew a deep breath, the hall's noise muffled behind heavy doors. For the first time in 3 years, she felt the invisible threads that had tied her to that family snap one by one. In the days that followed, rumors swirled faster than she could track. Someone said Zenobia sold the big house and retreated to another state. Others claimed Xavier's company lost key partners, that Soraya filed for divorce, that Langston vanished from social gatherings entirely. Maybe all of it was true. Maybe half. It didn't matter. Their story had turned inward. It no longer intersected with hers. She took her mother home, supervised medication schedules, arranged a visiting nurse. A week later she boarded a train back to Savannah with 2 sleepy children, a grateful father waving at the platform, and a heart that felt strangely light. At home above the bakery, she unpacked her suitcase on a quiet evening. Pearl's diary and the printed mirror photo slid into her hands. For a moment she considered burning them, erasing the last physical traces of a chapter she had finally closed. Instead, she put them into a box with other unnecessary things and slid it onto the highest shelf in her closet. Not as trophies of revenge, but as reminders of what she had survived. Later that night, with the twins asleep in their bunk beds and the hum of the refrigerators rising from the bakery below, she sat on her couch and scrolled through her contacts until she found the entry labeled, "Xavier, lawyer only." Her thumb hovered for a heartbeat, then tapped, delete. His name vanished from the screen like a stain wiped clean. In another place, Auntie May's voice wrapped the story's edges together for her listeners. She spoke of the sharp cruelty of a woman who treated people like tools and of the quieter, softer cowardice of a man who hid behind that cruelty until it did the work he lacked the courage to refuse. She wondered aloud which wound cut deeper, the knife wielded on purpose or the hand that hovered nearby and never reached out. She also spoke of two women who were supposed to be enemies but ended up standing side by side in the moment that mattered most, and of two children whose mere existence toppled a fortress built on lies. In the end, she told her audience, the story wasn't really about the fall of the St. Clair clan. It was about the rise of one woman who took the word useless and shattered it like cheap glass, building a life where she and her children were no one's project but her own. Then, as always, she invited listeners to share where they were in the world while they listened, and whether they had ever turned their own pain into armor. Somewhere in cities and small towns, on buses and in kitchens, people nodded along, thinking of their own quiet revolutions. And in Savannah, above a bakery that smelled of vanilla and dark chocolate, Kezia slept in a room finally empty of ghosts.